The political establishment is in absolute chaos right now. Keir Starmer's carefully constructed immigration strategy just got completely dismantled in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Richard Tice and Reform UK have just dropped a political bombshell that has left Labour and the Liberal Democrats scrambling for answers, and the fallout is nothing short of spectacular. What Tice has done is so audacious, so perfectly calculated, that even his harshest critics are struggling to respond. This isn't just another political spat. This is a full-blown crisis for the governing parties, and the implications are absolutely staggering. The masks are coming off, the hypocrisies are being exposed, and the British public is watching it all evolve in real time. What you were about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the entire migration debate in this country. And trust me, you need to hear every single word of this, because the establishment definitely doesn't want you knowing what's really happening behind closed doors. Richard Tice has just executed one of the most devastating political manoeuvres in recent British history, and the shockwaves are reverberating through Westminster like an earthquake. The Reform UK leader has announced a policy that's so brilliantly simple, yet so devastatingly effective, that Labour and Liberal Democrat councils are now facing an absolute nightmare scenario. Tice has declared that reform-controlled councils will begin systematically relocating asylum seekers and migrants to areas governed by Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Let that sink in for a moment. The very parties that have spent years signalling about compassion, diversity and open borders are now being forced to practice what they've been preaching, and they are absolutely losing their minds over it. This isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't about grand speeches in Parliament or tweets about kindness and inclusion. This is about real migrants arriving in real communities. And suddenly the progressive left doesn't seem quite so enthusiastic about their own policies. The genius of Tice's strategy cannot be overstated. For years, decades even, the political class has played a cynical game with immigration. They've championed policies that bring unprecedented numbers of people into the country, while ensuring that the consequences of those policies are felt primarily by working class communities who never voted for any of this. The wealthy liberal elites in their comfortable neighbourhoods have been completely insulated from the reality they've created. They've enjoyed feeling morally superior, while ordinary British families have watched their communities transform beyond recognition, their local services overwhelmed, their housing prospects evaporate, and their concerns dismissed as racism or xenophobia. It's been the ultimate in political hypocrisy, a tale of two Britons, where one class makes the rules and another class lives with the consequences. But Richard Tice has just changed the entire game. What makes this move so powerful is that it strips away all the pretense and forces a moment of absolute clarity. Labour and Liberal Democrat councillors can no longer hide behind abstract concepts and emotional appeals. They can no longer lecture working class voters about tolerance and integration from a safe distance. They're now going to experience firsthand what they've been inflicting on others. And their panic is palpable. Already we're seeing these councils scrambling to find legal mechanisms to refuse these migrants, desperately searching for technicalities and loopholes that might allow them to avoid the very responsibilities they've insisted everyone else should shoulder. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. These are the same people who have called for sanctuary cities, who have condemned any attempt to control immigration as heartless, who have insisted that Britain has unlimited capacity to absorb newcomers. But now that those newcomers might actually arrive on their doorsteps, suddenly they're singing a very different tune. The reaction from Keir Starmer's Labour Party has been nothing short of a complete meltdown. Government ministers are frantically trying to distance themselves from their own stated positions, issuing contradictory statements and clearly struggling to formulate a coherent response. How do you maintain your progressive credentials while simultaneously rejecting migrants you've said should be welcomed? How do you criticise reform for doing exactly what you've claimed should be done? The cognitive dissonance is tearing them apart. And it's absolutely glorious to witness. Labour MPs are being forced to confront the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their ideology. They want to be seen as compassionate and inclusive, but they also don't want to deal with any of the practical challenges that come with mass immigration. They want the moral high ground without any of the sacrifices, the praise without the price, the virtue without the burden. What's particularly revealing is how quickly the mask has slipped. Within hours of Tice's announcement, Labour-controlled councils were already claiming they lacked the resources to accommodate additional migrants. Wait, what? These are the same councils that have been demanding the government take in more refugees, the same politicians who have insisted that concerns about capacity are overblown. But suddenly, when it's their problem, resources are scarce and communities are at breaking point. The double standard is absolutely breathtaking. For years, they've been telling working class communities to just deal with it, to stop complaining, to be more welcoming. But when it comes to their own areas, their own constituents, their own political futures, suddenly compassion has its limits. This is the establishment playbook being exposed in real time. Rules for thee, but not for me. Diversity for you, but not for us. Sacrifice from the working class, but comfort for the elite. The Liberal Democrats are facing an even more catastrophic collapse of their carefully constructed image, and watching them squirm under the pressure has been absolutely fascinating. This is a party that has built its entire modern identity around being more progressive than Labour, more welcoming than anyone else, more compassionate to a fault. They've positioned themselves as the party of unlimited tolerance, the champions of open borders wrapped in a friendly yellow ribbon. Joe Swinson once stood in front of cameras declaring that there should be no upper limit on immigration whatsoever, that Britain should welcome anyone and everyone who wants to come. Ed Davey has repeatedly attacked the Conservative government for not being generous enough with asylum seekers, for not processing applications quickly enough, for not providing adequate support. The Liberal Democrats have made a political career out of being holier than thou on immigration, casting themselves as the moral conscience of British politics while painting anyone who disagrees as small-minded bigots. But now Richard Tice has called their bluff in the most spectacular way possible, and they have absolutely nowhere to hide. Liberal Democrat controlled councils are now in complete panic mode, issuing statements that read like they were written by completely different people than those who crafted their manifesto pledges. Council leaders in Richmond, in South Cambridgeshire, in Bath and North East Somerset are suddenly discovering all sorts of reasons why they can't possibly accommodate migrants in their areas. They're talking about strain on local services, about housing shortages, about community cohesion concerns, using literally the exact same arguments that Reform UK and working class voters have been making for years, and the arguments that these very same Liberal Democrats previously dismissed as dog whistle racism are now being deployed with desperate urgency when it's their own comfortable communities at stake. The transformation has been instantaneous and completely shameless. What was considered unacceptable rhetoric when coming from Nigel Farage or Richard Tice is now perfectly reasonable when coming from a Liberal Democrat councillor trying to protect their leafy suburb from the consequences of their own ideology. The speed with which these progressive politicians have abandoned their principles the moment those principles became inconvenient is genuinely stunning to observe. We're watching in real time as the entire progressive consensus on immigration reveals itself to be nothing more than performative. Politics, a virtue signalling exercise that was never meant to have real-world consequences for the people doing the signalling. These politicians never actually believed in what they were saying. They simply believed it was the right thing to say, the socially acceptable position to hold, the stance that would earn them praise from The Guardian and applause at dinner parties. But belief and performance are two very different things, and Richard Tice has just forced them to choose between their stated values and their actual interests. The choice they're making is revealing everything you need to know about the sincerity of their previous positions. What makes this situation even more delicious is that Reform UK isn't doing anything illegal or even particularly controversial by normal standards. They're simply redistributing resources within the existing framework of asylum policy. If migrants need to be housed somewhere, why shouldn't it be in areas governed by politicians who have actively advocated for more migration? Why shouldn't Labour and Liberal Democrat voters experience the reality of the policies they vote for? This is basic democratic accountability being applied to immigration policy, and the establishment, reacting like Tice, has committed some kind of war crime. The outrage from the political class has been hysterical and completely disproportionate, which tells you everything about how invested they are in maintaining the current system where they make the rules and others live with the consequences. They're not angry because what Tice is doing is wrong. They're angry because it's effective, because it exposes their hypocrisy, because it threatens to wake up their own voter base to the contradictions they've been comfortable ignoring. The media establishment has naturally rushed to Labour's defence, but even they're struggling to construct a coherent narrative that doesn't immediately collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. How do you condemn Reform for sending migrants to welcoming areas without admitting that maybe those areas aren't actually all that welcoming? How do you criticise the policy without implicitly agreeing with the argument that mass migration creates problems for local communities? The BBC and Sky News are tying themselves in knots trying to frame this as some kind of reform stunt or publicity gambit, but they can't escape the fundamental question at the heart of it all. If taking in migrants is such a moral imperative, such a basic duty of any decent society, then why are Labour and Liberal Democrat areas so desperate to avoid doing it? The journalists and commentators who have spent years lecturing the public about diversity and inclusion are now watching their allies prove that it was all just empty talk. The political fallout from Richard Tice's masterstroke is extending far beyond just the immediate scrambling of Labour and Liberal Democrat councils, and the cracks in the progressive consensus are widening by the hour. What we're witnessing is the complete unravelling of decades of carefully managed messaging around immigration, and the British public is taking notice in ways that should terrify the establishment. Polling data that's emerged in recent days shows a dramatic shift in how voters perceive the immigration debate, with significant numbers of people who previously supported open door policies now questioning whether the politicians who promoted those policies ever actually believed in them. The credibility of the entire political class on this issue is collapsing in spectacular fashion, and it's not just Reform supporters who are noticing the hypocrisy. Even traditional Labour voters in areas that have been transformed by mass immigration are looking at their representatives scrambling to avoid migrants and asking themselves why they've been told for years that their concerns were invalid. The Emperor has no clothes, and everyone can see it now. Keir Starmer himself has been conspicuously silent on the specifics of how his government plans to respond to Tice's policy, and that silence speaks volumes about the impossible position he finds himself in. Starmer has spent his entire leadership trying to reassure traditional Labour voters that he understands their concerns about immigration, while simultaneously keeping the progressive activist base happy by maintaining Labour's commitment to humanitarian obligations and international law. It's been a delicate balancing act that required never being too specific, never committing to hard numbers, never acknowledging the trade-offs involved in immigration policy. But Richard Tice has just demolished that carefully maintained ambiguity by creating a situation where Starmer has to take a concrete position. Does Labour support welcoming migrants into their council areas or not? It's a yes or no question, and there's no amount of political sophistication that can dodge it. If Starmer says yes, he alienates working class voters who are already abandoning Labour in droves. If he says no, he exposes the fundamental dishonesty of Labour's entire approach to immigration and confirms what millions of people have long suspected, that progressive immigration policy is something the elite expect others to implement while they remain untouched by the consequences. The situation has created absolute chaos within Labour's parliamentary party, with MPs from different factions offering wildly contradictory responses that reveal the deep divisions within the party. Metropolitan Labour MPs representing diverse inner-city constituencies are doubling down on welcoming rhetoric, insisting that their areas have always been open to migrants and will continue to be. Meanwhile, Labour MPs in red wall seats and traditional working class areas are furiously backpedalling, claiming that their communities are already overstretched and can't possibly take more people. The disconnect between these two wings of the party has never been more obvious, and it's tearing Labour apart from the inside. You have Labour politicians literally arguing with each other in public about whether immigration is good or bad, whether communities can cope or are at breaking point, whether concerns are legitimate or prejudiced. It's an absolute shambles that makes the party look completely incoherent and unprepared to govern on one of the most important issues facing the country. What's particularly damaging for Labour is that this crisis is entirely self-inflicted and completely avoidable if they had just been honest with the British public from the beginning. If Labour had acknowledged years ago that mass immigration creates real challenges for communities, that integration takes time and resources, that there are legitimate limits to how many people can be absorbed without causing social friction, they wouldn't be in this position now. But instead, they chose to gaslight working class voters, to dismiss concerns as racism, to pretend that problems didn't exist or were being exaggerated by the far right. They created a fantasy narrative where immigration was an unalloyed good with no downsides, where anyone who disagreed was motivated by hatred rather than genuine concern for their community. And now that fantasy has collided with reality in the most public and humiliating way possible. Labour councils are proving through their own actions that everything the so-called racists and bigots were saying was actually true, that communities do struggle with rapid demographic change, that resources are finite, that integration is difficult. The vindication of the concerns that Labour spent years mocking is complete. The Liberal Democrats are in an even worse position because their entire political brand is built on being the nice party, the reasonable centrists who care about fairness and evidence-based policy. But there's nothing fair about demanding that working class communities accept unlimited immigration while fighting tooth and nail to keep migrants out of affluent Liberal Democrat areas. There's nothing evidence-based about ignoring all of the data on integration challenges, housing pressure, and wage suppression when it suited the narrative. Then suddenly discovering that data, the moment it affects your own constituents. The Liberal Democrats have revealed themselves to be the ultimate champagne socialists, preaching values they have no intention of living by, demanding sacrifices they would never make themselves. The party that positioned itself as morally superior to everyone else has been exposed as the most cynical and hypocritical of all, and the damage to their reputation might be permanent. Voters can forgive many things in politics, but they struggle to forgive being treated like fools. And that's exactly what the Liberal Democrats have been doing to the British public for years.